The first thing Darrow did every morning was die a little. He would press 2 fingers to the neural shard behind his left ear, a chip of polished obsidian not much bigger than a fingernail, threaded with copper filament and human guilt, and for 11 seconds he would be somewhere else entirely, the galley of the Ironside Compact. Maybe. The smell of recycled air and burnt protein paste. Mira laughing at something Yusuf said, her hand over her mouth the way she always laughed when she thought she was being too loud. His son Pell, sitting cross-legged on the floor plates, drawing on the back of a supply manifest with a stylus, tongue poking out in concentration. Just 11 seconds, long enough to remember that there had once been a before. Then the shard's charge ran out. The warmth cut off like a hand yanked from fire, and Darrow was back in the dark with the rest of the underground. He sat up on his bunk, a slab of composite foam wedged into a cutout in the tunnel wall, one of 40 such cuts in the dormitory stretch they called the Warrens, and listened to the sector breathe. Somewhere in the lower shafts, the recyclers were grinding through their morning cycle. Someone was coughing in a way that had too much wet in it. A child was saying something over and over in a thin, insistent voice, and a woman was answering in the dead flat tone of someone who had been awake all night. Darrow pulled on his boots, laced them, and went to work. His work for the past 4 years had been killing people. The collective arrived on a Tuesday in March, which was funny only because Tuesday had always been Mira's least favorite day. She'd had a whole philosophy about it. Mondays were at least dramatic, the weight of the week ahead, the fresh start rhetoric, the coffee taken black and serious. But Tuesday was just Monday's ugly sequel, she used to say. Nothing interesting ever happens on a Tuesday. Something very interesting happened on that Tuesday. They came down in formations that the orbital arrays classified, in the 3 minutes before the arrays went dark, as atmospheric insertion events. 67 of them over the northern hemisphere alone, each one roughly the size of a city block, each one silent in a way that was somehow worse than noise. The old emergency broadcasts, the ones that lasted maybe 40 minutes before the transmitters were melted from orbit, described the collective as entities of unclear biological origin, exhibiting organized hostility. The people actually watching them come down used simpler language. They used words that are not worth repeating here. What the collective wanted with Earth was debated endlessly in the underground, in the way that people in the dark debate things they cannot change, with furious urgency and zero effect. Some said resources, some said territory, some said the collective didn't want anything from Earth specifically. That humans were simply in the way of something the collective was building at, a scale humans couldn't perceive. Darrow didn't debate it. The collective had landed, and within 18 months the surface was theirs, and the humans who hadn't died in the initial purges had gone underground. That was the whole story. The reasons were for people with the luxury of caring about reasons. Darrow had been a staff sergeant in the Expeditionary Ground Forces when it happened. He'd been on a training rotation, deep in the northern mountain tunnels, running a 3-week survival course with 12 recruits, when the world ended above them. By the time they dug their way to a functioning communications node, the war, if it could be called a war, which implied some chance of winning, was effectively over. The EGF command structure had fragmented into regional groups that called themselves by different names and answered to different people, and mostly argued about food and ammunition. He'd Finmara and Pell in a refugee camp in the old transit tunnels under what had been a major city. Pell had been 4 years old. Mira had a cut on her forehead that hadn't been properly cleaned and was starting to go ugly. She'd looked at Darrow, at the uniform that no longer meant anything, at the rifle he still carried by habit, and said, very quietly, "Are you going to help us or just stand there?" It wasn't a question. He'd helped. He had kept helping for 3 years. He had been remarkably good at it. And then, 18 months ago, in a supply run that went wrong in all, the way supply runs went wrong, Mira and Pell had been caught in a collective sweep of the eastern tunnels, and, By the time Darrow fought his way back to their position, there was nothing to fight his way back to. The neural shard had been Mira's idea. She'd read about them in a pre-collective tech brief. Experimental memory augmentation, meant for trauma counseling. There was a woman in Sector 11 who could make a crude version, and Mira had badgered Darrow for months to go get one fitted. He'd finally agreed 3 weeks before the sweep. More to stop the badgering than because he believed it would help anything. He thought about that a lot. About agreeing 3 weeks too late for it to matter for anyone but him. The faction that ran Sector 7 called itself the Convergence, which sounded better than what it was, which was an armed theocracy organized around a man named Orlin Voss. Voss was tall in the way that men who have never been in real danger were tall, expansive, performative, every movement calibrated for an audience. He had come out of the pre-collective corporate infrastructure, some kind of logistics executive, and he had channeled the organizational obsession and the need to be deferred to into a new kind of religion with himself at the center. The Convergence's doctrine was vague enough to mean anything he needed it to mean on any given day, which was the point. Voss believed in hierarchy. He believed in compliance. He believed in the kind of order that looked like order from a distance and felt up close like a boot. Darrow worked for the Convergence's enforcement arm, which Voss called the Shepherds. He had not wanted to work for Voss. He had needed medical access, real antibiotics, a bone knitter for the compound fracture in his left wrist, and the Convergence controlled the medical stores in Sector 7. The terms were simple and not open to negotiation. He did their work. He got access to their supplies. After the wrist healed, he'd kept telling himself he would leave. That was 18 months ago, and he was still here, which told him something about himself that he preferred not to examine too closely. Lyndon Marsh ran the Shepherds operationally. Lyndon had been a police inspector before the collective, which meant he had the kind of face that looked reasonable while doing unreasonable things. He had a gift for making everything sound procedural. He scheduled briefings the way other people scheduled dentist appointments, and he used words like engagement and interdiction and asset recovery so that the actual work of it, the killing, the coercion, the things that happened in rooms that didn't have windows, sounded like paperwork. Darrow and Lyndon had known each other before. Sector security, not friends exactly, but the kind of colleagues who shared coffee and occasional information, and mostly stayed out of each other's way. Darrow had been surprised to find him here. He was not sure Lyndon had been surprised to find Darrow. "New assignment," Lyndon said, and slid a data chip across the briefing table. Darrow didn't pick it up. "Another fractionist?" "Shepherd, from the Ascendancy." The Ascendancy was the other main faction, based out of the deep tunnels in Sector 12, led by a woman named Khalees, who ran things differently from Voss. More council-based, less theater, more actual ideology, and therefore, in Darrow's experience, more genuinely dangerous. The fractionist zealots were easier. They believed in apocalypse and acted accordingly, which meant they were predictable. The Ascendancy believed in survival and acted accordingly, which meant they were adaptable. Name? She goes by Rain. Varo Rain. Runs interdiction for Callus, apparently. Word is she's been in our tunnels running reconnaissance. Darrow picked up the chip. Held it. Just her? Lyndon paused in a way that meant there was more. She has a kid with her. Darrow set the chip back down. The kid's hers, Lyndon said quickly, in the tone of a man diffusing something. It's not a hostage situation. Just a woman doing a run with her daughter because she had nowhere to leave her. Or that's how it looks from the intercept. How old? Does it matter, Lyndon? Lyndon looked at the table. 7, maybe. 8. The number sat in the room between them. Darrow looked at it for a while. Voss wants them brought in, Lyndon said. Both of them. It doesn't have to be. It never does, Darrow said. He stood up. I'll be in contact. He took the chip anyway. He always took the chip. He found them in sublevel 4, in the old transit maintenance shafts that ran under the original city's eastern quarter. Someone had scratched a map into the tunnel wall near the junction. a rough thing made with a piece of steel rebar. And Darrow stopped when he saw it. It showed the route to the water reclaim station, the direction to the nearest working ventilation node, the safest sleeping alcove in the section, standard refugee cartography, the kind you made when you wanted the next person through to have a better time than you did. He stood there looking at it for longer than he should have. The woman was around his age, give or take a year of underground hardship that made everyone's age vague. She had the look of someone who'd been moving through tight spaces for a long time, economical in every movement, weight always forward, eyes that completed a full sweep of any room before the rest of her face reacted to anything in it. She was armed with a collapsed stock rifle that she wore like a part of her anatomy. The child was asleep on a folded thermal sheet in the alcove behind her, one arm flung over her head in the boneless, absolute way children sleep when they feel safe. Darrow stepped into the alcove's outer corridor. The woman had her rifle up before his second step landed. He held his hands out. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of, here's what my hands are doing so you can see I'm making a choice. Convergence, she said. Not a question either. Yes, you're here for me. Yes. She didn't lower the rifle. And my daughter. He looked past her to the child. The thermal sheet had a design on it, faded, but you could still make out the shape. Stars, a pattern of constellations, the old astronomical ones, the ones with names from before any of this. Pell had had one like it. Not the samest exactly, but the kind of thing that came from the same world, the same impulse to put something beautiful against the dark. How long has she been asleep? Darrow said. The woman stared at him. What? Your daughter, how long has she been down? About 4 hours. Why? Because if you fire that weapon in this shaft, she'll wake up scared, and it'll take you a while to get her calm again. I'll be dead, but you'll still be in a compromised position, with a frightened child, and at least 2 more shepherds somewhere in this sector who aren't me. Silence. The rifle didn't move. I'm not going to complete the assignment, Darrow said. Why not? He thought about saying something honest. He thought about the neural shard, the 11 seconds, the thermal sheet with the constellation pattern. He thought about Mira's voice saying, "Are you going to help us?" Or just stand there. Because she's 7 or 8 years old, he said. And that's enough. Her name was Varro Rain, and she didn't trust him, which was correct. She watched him the way people watched things they expected to explode. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular focused attention of someone who'd already decided what to do when it went wrong. Her daughter's name was Sable. The girl had her mother's eyes, dark and quick-moving, and she had spent the first 30 minutes after waking up studying Darrow with the careful, unnerving scrutiny of children who have grown up in places where reading people quickly is a survival skill. You work for Voss, Rain said. They were moving through the sub-farm maintenance shafts, heading west, away from the junction where the other shepherds would eventually come, looking. I work for my access to Convergence medical stores, Darrow said. It's not the same thing. In practice, he agreed. Less than you'd think, more than I'd like. That's not really a comfort. I know. Sable was carrying a small pack on her back that clinked softly when she moved. At some point she fell into step beside Darrow, which her mother noticed and didn't comment on, which told Darrow something about Rain's discipline, and also about the degree to which she was watching him. What do you want? Rain said. Out of Sector 7. You can't go back to the Convergence. No. And you don't want to come to the Ascendancy. Not particularly. So nothing, specifically. I want to be somewhere that isn't here. He looked at her. What do you want? She was quiet for a while. There are stories about the Eastern Surface Passages, she said finally. The ones that come up near the old industrial infrastructure, where the collective established their primary processing stations. That's not exactly a destination people generally aspire to. The stories say there are pockets, places the collective hasn't swept, residual human infrastructure that survived the initial purges, because it was too deep or too small to be worth the effort of destroying. She paused. There's also a story about a frequency, a broadcast, human origin, cycling on a loop, somewhere in the eastern quadrant. Darrow thought about this. You believe it. I believe it's worth dying to check, Rain said. Which is different? Sable, without looking up, said, I think it's real. Her voice was perfectly matter-of-fact. I heard it once, before, through one of the old radio shells. It was someone reading names, just names, over and over, like a list. Darrow didn't say anything for a long time. How many names? He said finally. A lot, Sable said. Too many to count. They needed a guide for the Eastern Passages. Rain knew someone, which was a sentence that, underground, could mean almost anything on the spectrum, from valuable asset to mortal danger. In this case, it meant a man who occupied a tunnel junction in sublevel 6 that he had apparently claimed as personal territory through a combination of physical presence and the willingness to smell things that other people wouldn't. His name, according to the section's general scuttlebutt, was Tooth. He was not called Tooth because of his teeth. He was called Tooth because he had, at some point in the past, bitten through the carotid artery of a collective ground unit, using only his mouth and the element of surprise. Darrow found this information interesting in a professional sense. Tooth was small and wiry, in the way of people who burned everything they ate, with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm so much as it was compressed. He smelled, generously, of everything that had ever passed through sublevel 6, and he had an unsettling habit of turning his face very slightly to the side when someone was talking to him, as though he was listening with something other than his ears. Eastern Surface Passages, Rain said. Why? Tooth said. Because. This seemed somehow to satisfy him. He tilted his head the other way. Convergence will be in the shafts within 2 hours. They've been pushing west since this morning. He looked at Darrow, or rather, aimed his face in Darrow's direction, in a way that suggested looking was happening, just not with his eyes primarily. You're the one they're looking for. One of them, Darrow said. You smell like a shepherd. You don't smell like the others, though. Tooth seemed to consider this. They smell like obedience. You smell like. He paused, appeared to be consulting something internal, like someone who's been carrying something too long. Rain made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Tooth named a price in antibiotics and one functioning water filter. Rain had both. They moved within the hour. The Eastern Passages were older than the rest of the underground. Pre-collective, pre-catastrophe, the deep infrastructure of a civilization that had built and built and built, and then found out, in the worst possible way, that you could not build your way out of everything. The walls here were the original transit tunnel composite, pale gray and close, marked at intervals by maintenance stamps and system codes in languages that had been superseded by the time the collective arrived. Sable ran her fingers along the stamps as they walked. Those are old, she said. Very, Darrow said. Older than the collective? Old enough that whoever made them never knew the collective existed. She considered this. That's nice, she said, and he wasn't sure what she meant, but he thought he understood it. The collective's presence in the eastern sector was different from what Darrow had experienced in the central shafts. In the center, they were aggressive and immediate. Patrol units cycling through regular routes, sensor nodes mounted at every junction, the constant low hum of their communication architecture bleeding through the walls. Here it was quieter, older marks, older burns. This was territory the collective had swept early and then largely abandoned, which meant it was dangerous in the specific way of places that had been through something terrible and then been left alone to become something else. Tooth moved through it like he lived there, which he more or less did. He stopped at a junction where 3 tunnels converged and stood absolutely still for almost a full minute. Then he said very quietly, "There's a unit, northern branch, not moving, dormant maybe, or feeding." "Feeding?" Rain said. "They do that," Tooth said. He looked at the wall. "They have a word for it. Or not a word. A frequency. They go still and their signal changes. And the change looks like what feeding would look like if feeding were a kind of sound. How do you know what their frequencies look like? Darrow said. Tooth touched the side of his head, which was either a gesture toward his ears or something that lived deeper than ears. I listened for a long time, he said. That's what you do when you're the only one in a section. You listen until you understand. They took the southern branch. The dormant unit was not dormant. It picked them up at the third junction past the branch point, emerging from a crawlway in the wall, with the particular fluid wrongness of collective ground units in tight spaces. They were not built for tunnels, not exactly, but they adapted with an ease that was deeply unsettling to watch, their forms compressing and reorienting in ways that violated the assumptions you'd made about how things moved through space. This one was the standard patrol configuration, roughly bipedal at range, but with the jointed secondary limbs folded against the thorax and the sensor cluster at the crown, cycling through its frequencies in the pale, sweeping rhythm that looked, in the dark, like a lantern carried by something that had never learned to be afraid. Darrow shot it twice, center mass. The first shot staggered it. The second dropped it. The problem with collective ground units was that they reported before they died. Move, Rain said, and they moved. They ran for 8 minutes through the eastern shafts. Tooth somewhere ahead of them making navigational sounds that were barely sounds at all. Stable keeping pace, with her mother's hand on her collar. Darrow taking the rearmost position and listening to the tunnels change around them. The collective's response architecture was fast, but it was also, in his experience, predictable at the small scale. They swept from known vectors. They flooded approach corridors before they checked alternatives. It was not a flaw in their design so much as the consequence of being optimized for large-scale operations. They were extraordinary at clearing territory, that bad at finding the specific thing that had gone to ground. Here, Tooth said, and vanished. Here was a maintenance access behind a partial collapse of the original tunnel wall, a gap barely wide enough for a person if the person breathed out and committed. Tooth was already through. Rain went next, pushing Sable ahead of her. Darrow squeezed through last, scraping his left shoulder against the edge, and then they were in a space that was entirely different from everything around it. It was a room. A real room, not a tunnel stretch or a repurposed shaft, but an actual designed space with ceiling panels and a floor that was flat and level and covered in a thick layer of dust that recorded every step in it, like a confession. The panels above held the dead gray squares of lighting fixtures that had not been powered in years. Along one wall, a rank of equipment consoles sat in a long row, their screens dark, trailing cable bundles that disappeared into the wall like roots. And on the far wall, stenciled in the red-orange safety paint of the old pre-collective emergency infrastructure, a frequency signature, a broadcast point. Sable walked toward it. She reached out and touched the stenciled numbers with her fingertips, and in the gesture, there was something that was not hope exactly, but was the shape of hope, the place where hope would have gone if there had been more room for it. This is it, she said. The consoles were dead, but not beyond recovery. Rain had the technical background. She'd been infrastructure before the collective, civil telecommunications. And she worked the primary console with the focused quiet of someone solving a problem that actually had a solution, which was the most useful kind of quiet there was. Tooth sat in the doorway and listened to the tunnels. Darrow stood between them and tried not to look at the stenciled frequency signature too much, because looking at it made something happen in his chest that he didn't entirely trust. Sable sat on the floor near the wall and took out a thick sheet of something, pressed composite fiber, pre-collective, the kind used for non-critical documentation, and began to draw on it with a piece of sharp stone. He watched her for a while without meaning to. She was drawing the room. Not stylized, not a child's interpretation of it. An actual architectural sketch. Careful proportions. The console row reproduced with each unit's relative height indicated. The cable bundles following their actual paths. Her tongue was not poking out. Her face was perfectly still. "Where did you learn to do that?" Darrow said. "My mom showed me before." She said that if you could draw what you saw, you could remember it properly. That most people misremember things because they never really looked at them in the first place. Darrow reached up and pressed 2 fingers to the neural shard. He didn't trigger it. The charge wouldn't cycle for another 6 hours, but he pressed his fingers to it anyway, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's still there. Smart woman, he said. Sable looked up at him, looked at his fingers against his ear. What's that? He thought about not answering. A way of remembering, he said. Someone I knew had it made for me. So you don't forget them? So I don't forget them. She looked at him for a moment with those quick, dark eyes. Then she looked back at her drawing and made a small adjustment to the perspective of the console row. I don't need one, she said. I remember everything already. A pause. It's not always helpful. No, Darrow said. It isn't. The consoles came live 2 hours later. Rain had rerouted the power draw from a secondary line that was still, impossibly, carrying current from somewhere in the deep infrastructure. A legacy system, the kind that ran on its own inertia and hadn't been connected to anything that could turn it off. The screens came up in sequence, dim and flickering, displaying strings of status information in the standardized pre-collective format net. And then, underneath the system noise, the frequency, it was exactly what Sable had described. A human voice, recorded, looped, reading names. Not slowly, not with ceremony, just names, one after another, in a measured cadence that sounded like a list being read by someone who had all the time in the world and was not going to rush it. They listened for a long time. It's a registry, Rain said finally. Someone put together a survivor registry and automated the broadcast. When? Darrow said. The timestamp on the broadcast header says it's been running for 19 months. 19 months. 4 months before Mira and Pell. He listened to the names. He knew rationally that the list was too old to contain what he was looking for, that the broadcast had begun well before the Eastern sweeps. He listened anyway. Lyndon Marsh found them on the 3rd day. He came in through the Eastern branch with 6 convergence shepherds, which was more than he needed for 2 people, and a child and a guide. He also came in with a collective signal disruptor, which was the kind of equipment that didn't belong in shepherd hands, and whose presence told Darrow immediately that the shape of what was happening was different from what he'd assumed. Lyndon stood at the junction outside the maintenance room's hidden entrance. He knew about the gap in the wall. He was making sure Darrow knew that he knew. Come out, Lyndon said. I'm not going to pretend I don't see the entry point, Kale. They'd been ready for this. Rain had blocked the consoles. The frequency was still broadcasting, but the equipment was now showing a dead screen, its hardware reconfigured so that the signal appeared to originate from a .4 tunnels away. Tooth was already gone, out through a secondary access behind the power routing panel, per the plan. Sable was in the farthest corner, behind a fallen ceiling section that gave real cover. Darrow came out through the gap, alone. Where are the others? Lyndon said. Gone, Darrow said. East. They left this morning. Lyndon looked at him with the expression he always used when he knew he was being lied to, and was deciding what to do. About it, you know I have the disruptor. I see it. If I activate it, anything electronic in this sector shuts down, including whatever you people have been running in that room. Darrow said nothing. What's in there, Kale? Old equipment. Nothing functional. Lyndon looked at the 6 shepherds, looked back at Darrow. Voss wants the woman and the child. Voss especially wants the child, actually, which I've been trying not to think about too carefully. He said it the way he said most things, procedurally, like it was an item on a list that he was just reading out, not something he was responsible for. He's going to expand east. He needs Sector 12, and to take Sector 12, he needs either the Ascendancy's cooperation or a hostage that makes cooperation irrelevant. She's 8 years old, Darrow said. I know, Lyndon. I know what she is, Lyndon said. His voice had something in it that hadn't been there before, something that had been carefully removed over a long career of procedural language and was now visible through the absence. I've been doing this a long time, Kale. I've been making the calculation every day. This horror in exchange for that protection. This compromise in exchange for that stability. Voss isn't good, but Voss is order. And order is what keeps the recyclers running. And the medicals stocked. And the recyclers are running because the people operating them haven't given up yet, Darrow said. Not because of Voss. Maybe. Lyndon looked at the disruptor. He looked at it for a long time. Maybe. Then he set it on the floor of the tunnel. The 6 shepherds didn't move. They were looking at Lyndon with the particular blankness of people waiting for instructions. And the instructions were not coming. I'm going to tell Voss you were gone before we arrived, Lyndon said. I'm going to tell him the eastern shafts are clear, and there's nothing here worth his attention. I can do that twice, maybe 3 times before the inconsistency becomes a problem. Why? Darrow said. Lyndon picked up the disruptor, tucked it back under his arm. Because you're not the only one who's been carrying something too long. He turned and looked at his shepherds. We're done here. Western extraction double time. He walked away without looking back. The 6 shepherds followed him. Darrow stood in the tunnel for a moment. Then he went back through the gap. The message went out on the frequency 3 days later. It was Rain's design, Darrow's voice, and Sable's list. The girl had spent 2 days going through the broadcast registry. All 19 months of it, every name, and cross-referencing it against the scattered population tallies she'd memorized from ascendancy records. What she produced was a map. Not a geographic map, but a network map. Who was where, who had been reached, who had not yet been contacted. The gaps in the survival architecture that could be filled if someone was trying to fill them. Darrow read the message twice into the recording buffer before Rain transmitted it. The first time was too formal. The second time was right. It said, if you can hear this, you are not the only one. It said, there is a point in the eastern sector, reference coordinates attached, that is secure and running, and staffed by people who intend to stay here. It said, we have a registry, we have power, we have a channel. What we don't have is everyone who should be on it. It said, we are going to keep reading names until the list is empty, and then we are going to start filling it again. And we are going to keep doing this until either we run out of names or the collective makes us stop. It said, come if you can, don't come if you can't. We'll be here either way. Orland Foss came himself. That surprised Darrow, actually. Voss was not a man who led from the front in any meaningful sense. He led from the raised platform in the Convergence's main hall, surrounded by amplification and ceremony, and the kind of authority that required an audience to function. Coming personally into the eastern shafts was, for him, the equivalent of crawling. He brought 40 people. He brought the signal disruptor, a different model. Larger, military grade. The kind that didn't leave anything electronic in a quarter-kilometer radius, doing anything at all. And he brought something else, something Darrow hadn't expected, a collective compliance unit. The collective had them in all the occupied sectors. Eventually, they were not ground combatants. They were smaller, slicker, built for precision interaction rather than sweeps. They worked through the Quislings and the desperate, and through humans, who had decided that cooperation was survival, and were not wrong, in the narrowest possible sense. Voss had apparently decided that his interest in the eastern sector aligned well enough with whatever the collective wanted here to make the arrangement worth both parties' time. Darrow looked at the compliance unit standing at Voss's left shoulder and felt something, cold and clarifying, move through him. He understood now. The child specifically, the registry broadcast, the eastern sector. The collective didn't want to sweep it. Too costly. Too much residual infrastructure that might be damaged in a conventional purge. What they wanted was what the compliance unit was designed to facilitate. Voluntary surrender. Compliant integration. A human face on the process of absorption. Sable's voice, over the frequency, saying, come here, it's safe. And every human who answered, walking into something they'd believed was rescue. Kale. Voss's voice was the kind of voice that had spent years learning how to fill large spaces. It sounded strange and slightly deflated in the tunnel, like a stage actor performing to an empty house. You've caused considerable disruption. Darrow was thinking. He was thinking fast and in detail, which was a thing he could do when the situation required it, because Mira had taught him that panic was just urgency with no structure, and structure was something you could impose on almost anything if you were willing to be ruthless about it. He had 3 people on his side, Rain and her rifle, Tooth somewhere in the upper shafts, position unknown, and himself with 1 standard sidearm, and the kind of intimate familiarity with the eastern shaft layout that came from spending 4 days learning it. Voss had 40 shepherds, a military disruptor, and a collective compliance unit. The compliance unit was the problem, not the most dangerous thing in the tunnel. The disruptor was the most dangerous thing in the tunnel, and Voss had his thumb on its activation key. But the compliance unit was the thing that could not be allowed to leave. If it left with the frequency data, the registry, the map that Sable had built. It left with the blueprint for how to reach every surviving human in the eastern sector. Put the disruptor down, Darrow said. Voss smiled. The kind of smile that people who have never been in real danger use when they want to look like they are in complete control of a situation. I think not. You've been to the Ascendancy, Darrow said. You've met Callus. You've negotiated with her. Something moved behind Voss's eyes. What of it? She knows where you are right now. She's known for about 2 hours. He paused. Because we told her. The collective compliance unit turned its sensor cluster toward Darrow. Evaluating. The cluster's sweep was precise and mechanical, and held none of the fear response. Tells that human eyes betrayed. It was pure assessment, pure data collection, completely without the one thing that made it possible to read. Uncertainty. The collective were not uncertain. That was one of the things that made them terrifying, and one of the things that made them, in a very specific way, limited. Humans were almost nothing but uncertainty, and they'd built some extraordinarily interesting things with it. The Ascendancy has 50 fighters in the western shafts of Sector 8 right now, Darrow said. They've been there for 6 hours. Rain called them. He looked at the 40 shepherds, who were starting to do the math. Not as an attack force, as a circuit breaker. If the convergence moves on the eastern sector in force, the Ascendancy moves on the convergence's western positions. Not to win, just to create a complication Voss can't resolve in the time he has. You're bluffing, Voss said, but the expansive voice had gotten smaller. Your signal disruptor will kill the frequency broadcast, Darrow said, which means the collective loses the tool they brought you here to provide them. I don't know what the collective does to compliance partners who fail to deliver. He looked at the unit. But I'd guess it's not pleasant. The compliance unit was still evaluating. Its sensor cluster completed a full rotation. Then it did something that Darrow had never seen a collective unit do in a non-combat context. It stepped backward. 1 step. A small, precise retreat, Voss noticed. His face did something complicated. The frequency stays up, Darrow said. The registry stays human. The eastern sector stays uncontrolled. And you go back to Sector 7 and tell the collective that the eastern integration is proving technically difficult and will require additional time. Which is true. Which will keep buying us time for as long as you say it convincingly. And why would I do that? Darrow pressed 2 fingers to the neural shard. Not triggering it, just acknowledging it. Because you ran logistics before all this, he said. And the fundamental question of logistics is, what is the most efficient route from where you are to where you need to be? You want to survive. You want power. You want your people to keep existing in some organized form. The collective doesn't give you any of those things long term. They give them to you, on loan, and the loan terms are whatever they decide today, which they can change tomorrow. He looked at the 40 shepherds again, but a working human infrastructure in the eastern sector, connected to the Ascendancy and broadcasting survivor coordinates, that's something you could actually be part of. Something that still exists in 10 years. As a junior partner, Voss said. The contempt in his voice was real at least. As a living one. Long silence. The tunnels breathed around them. One of the shepherds, young, toward the back of the group. with the look of someone who had been doing Voss's work slightly too long, and was starting to notice what it felt like. Lowered his weapon. Not dramatically, not a gesture, just put the barrel down quietly and stood there. Then another one did. Voss watched it happen. His jaw moved as though he was going to say something. Then it stopped. The compliance unit took a second step backward. "Keep the disruptor," Darrow said, "but keep it turned off." He stepped to the side, clearing the path to the western branch. "The rest is your choice." Voss left. He didn't say anything as he went. He took 37 of his shepherds with him. 3 stayed, standing in the tunnel with the quiet, irreversible look of people who had made a decision they couldn't undo and had found that they didn't want to. The compliance unit left with Voss. That was the unknown variable. Darrow watched it go and held the uncertainty of it in his hands, which was all he could do. Rain emerged from the maintenance room gap. "Was any of that true?" she said. "The ascendancy part was mostly true," Darrow said. "I sent a message. I don't know if Callis responded. I don't know if 50 fighters actually moved into Sector 8. But you said it like it was true." "I said it in the specific way that true things sound when you're committed to them." He looked at the 3 remaining shepherds. The calculation about the collective was true. They're not generous with compliance partners who fail. Voss will keep us insulated if he thinks it buys him something. For how long? Long enough for the frequency to reach the people it needs to reach. He paused. Maybe longer than that. Things change. She looked at him. "That's not a plan. No. It's an intention. Plans are what intentions become when you have more information." From inside the maintenance room, Sable's voice. "The frequency is still running." A pause. Someone answered. They answered in 1s and 2s at first, and then in groups. They came through the eastern shafts with a careful, disbelieving gate of people who had been promised things before and knew what that cost. They came with what they carried: tools, food stores, children. The particular fierce brevity of people who had edited their lives down to the essential and were not interested in being told they'd gotten the calculation wrong. They came with skills: water treatment, electrical, medical, the kind of applied knowledge that the pre-collective world had called infrastructure and that the current world called survival. Tooth met them at the junction and led them in. He turned out to be extraordinary at this. He knew the tunnels better than anyone alive, which meant he was the difference between making it to the maintenance room and not making it. And he brought people in with the same instinctive, smelling and listening navigation that had kept him alive through years of solitary occupation. He didn't say much to them. He didn't have to. He knew the way and they needed the way, and that was the whole of it. Rain ran the intake. She was methodical and gentle, and remarkably good at asking questions people had given up on having anyone interested in, like what they knew and what they'd seen and what they'd lost. She added names to the registry with the same focus she'd brought to the electrical: careful, systematic, aware that each name was not an entry in a database, but a person connected to other persons connected to information that, assembled correctly, was a map of everything they needed to know to stay alive. Sable kept drawing. She drew the new arrivals, faces, hands, the specific ways people carried themselves after years underground. She drew the layout of the maintenance room as it changed with the addition of equipment and people, and the slow accumulation of things that happened when a place became a place rather than a location. She drew the tunnel maps that Tooth described to her, translating his spatial sense into something visual, something that could be shared. Darrow watched her fill the composite sheets and thought about Mira's voice, about the specific philosophy of looking at things so that you could remember them properly, so that the memory held its shape, so that the past didn't lose resolutions, the way recordings degraded in high-moisture environments. Sable had inherited the skill without the need for a neural shard, which was, he thought, probably the better way to carry it. Less weight. He was sitting with this thought one evening, or what passed for evening in the maintenance room, which was a reduction in the console brightness that Rain had programmed as a circadian cue. when the compliance unit came back. Alone. It came in through the western access, which was not the gap in the wall, but a different entry point that nobody had thought to watch, because the western access was a collective standard entry, and the assumption had been that collective units required collective authority to be in proximity to human infrastructure. That assumption was wrong. It stood at the edge of the room and was still. The sensor cluster rotated once and then stopped. The 40-odd people in the room did various things with their weapons. Tooth, who was near the door, made no move at all, which Darrow had come to understand meant Tooth was performing a calculation. The compliance unit did not have a voice in any conventional sense. What it had was a communication interface, a panel in its thorax casing that could display text or emit a standard translation tone. The panel lit up. The text it displayed was, "We know what this place is." Darrow stepped forward. "Yes. We know what the broadcast contains. Yes. We came to negotiate." "That word means different things to different parties," Darrow said. "What does it mean to you?" The panel went dark for a moment. Then, "We do not understand why you build this. The surface is ours. The underground is transient. You cannot win." "We know," Darrow said. "You build it anyway." "Yes." The sensor cluster rotated again, stopped. The room was very quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Darrow said. The panel stayed lit, which he took as yes. "Before you came here, before the insertion, did your mission planners model this?" He gestured at the room, at the people in it, at the composite sheets covered in drawings, at the equipment humming with the recycled power of a dead civilization, at the frequency still cycling through its list of names. "Did they predict this specific response?" Long pause, then. "No. What did they predict?" "Dispersal, degradation, cessation." Darrow nodded slowly. "And instead you got this." He pressed 2 fingers to the neural shard. "Let them rest there. We don't do this because we think we can win," he said. "We do this because this is what we are. We're the species that carves directions into tunnel walls for strangers we'll never meet. We're the species that broadcasts names into empty frequencies because we don't want anyone to be unaccounted for. We build places and we fill them. And when those places are taken from us, we build new ones. And we do this not because we're optimistic, but because the alternative is to become something other than ourselves. And that's the one thing that nothing." He looked at the compliance unit. "Absolutely nothing that you brought with you has been able to take from us." He dropped his fingers from the shard. "So no," he said, "we cannot win. But we can keep doing this for a very long time. And every person who makes it to this room and hears their name on that list is someone who is not on your dispersal projection. Every drawing on those walls is something your mission planners couldn't account for." He looked at Sable, who was watching with the focused quiet of someone capturing a moment for later. "You came to negotiate. Tell me what you're offering. We'll tell you what we need, and then we'll see what kind of agreement is possible between something that wants us to stop and something that categorically won't." The compliance unit was still for a long time. Its sensor cluster made 3 slow rotations. The room breathed. Then the panel lit again. "Proceed." The agreement, such as it was, lasted 7 months. It was not a peace. It was a pause. A zone of calculated mutual tolerance in the eastern sector, held together by the fact that Voss kept insulating it from above, and the compliance unit kept filing inconclusive reports, and the ascendancy kept 24 fighters in the Sector 8 shafts as an implicit threat that everyone understood and no one acknowledged. It was the kind of arrangement that could collapse on a Wednesday for reasons that had nothing to do with anything anyone in the eastern sector did. While it held, the registry grew. 312 names in the first month, 700 in the second. By the 5th month, when the frequency had been picked up by 2 secondary broadcast points that Rain's team had located and brought online, the list had over 4,000 entries. There were names Darrow didn't know. There were names that others in the room knew and wept over, quietly, in the way people wept underground. Contain private. The grief of people who had learned to keep their internal weather from affecting their external functioning. And there were names that no one knew yet. Names from sectors too far out to have been reached, broadcasting their position into the frequency, in the hope that someone was still listening. The frequency kept cycling. On the 143rd day, Darrow triggered the neural shard at the wrong time. Not in the morning, not in his bunk, but in the middle of a briefing, because something Rain said had a cadence. That was Mira's cadence, the same rhythm of the same specific kind of statement. And his fingers were on the shard before he'd made a decision about it. 11 seconds of the galley on the Ironside compact. Pell on the floor with his stylus. Mira's hand over her mouth. He came back to the briefing room. Rain was watching him with an expression he'd come to recognize. Not concern exactly, not pity, but the specific attention of someone who was prepared to act if action became necessary, and was otherwise giving him his privacy. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. We can take 5. No, he looked at the map, at the network of red marks that each indicated a contact, a voice on the frequency, a person somewhere in the dark who'd heard their name and answered. I'm fine. Where were we? Sable, without looking up from her drawing. The northern outflow corridor, the one that Tooth says connects to sub-level 9. Right, Darrow said. The northern outflow. They went back to work. The compliance unit came to see him, specifically, on the 158th day. Not the room. Him. It found him in the eastern corridor during a perimeter walk, and stood in the tunnel in the particular still way of a thing that had decided to say something and was organizing itself to say it. He stopped, waited. The panel lit. You lost people you were responsible for. Yes. The neural shard is for remembering them. Yes. We were told that humans eventually discard grief instruments, that the function becomes vestigial, that you move on. Darrow looked at the panel for a while. Who told you that? The unit was still. Then the models. The models were wrong, Darrow said. We don't discard them. We carry them. He touched the shard. That's different from being disabled by them. We're very good at carrying things. The sensor cluster rotated once. Then, we cannot model this adequately. Your persistence parameters exceed our projections consistently. I know, Darrow said. He started walking again. Keep trying, though. It's good for you to have something to work on. He was fairly certain the compliance unit did not understand that this was a joke. He was equally certain it filed the exchange anyway, somewhere in its report architecture, as another data point in the category it had probably labeled anomalous behavior, and was running out of subcategories for. Good, he thought. The broadcast was still running on the 161st day, when Tooth came back from the outer tunnels with a group of 11 people, and on a piece of information. The information was the northern outflow corridor connected to sub-level 9, as suspected. Sub-level 9 contained what appeared to be a pre-collective industrial infrastructure node that had been overlooked in the initial collective survey because it was listed in the original plans as decommissioned. It was not decommissioned. It was running on the same legacy power circuit that had kept the maintenance room alive, and it had, among other things, surface access, real surface access. A vertical shaft, sealed but intact, leading up to somewhere in the old industrial quarter of what had been a major city. Darrow stood in the corridor and listened to Tooth describe it, and thought about what the surface meant. He thought about it for a long time. We don't know what's up there, Rain said beside him. No. The collective controls the surface. Yes, this is not a plan. This is still just an intention. Yes, Darrow said, but the direction of it is different now. She was quiet for a moment, then, do you want to go see it? He did. He very much did. Not to go through. Not yet. Not without more information. Not without a network that was more prepared than it currently was. But to see it. To stand at the bottom of a vertical shaft and look up at a sealed door and know that on the other side of that door was a sky that had been there the whole time, going about its business above the catastrophe the way skies did, unconcerned with what had happened below it. Yes, he said. They went north. The shaft was exactly as Tooth had described it. 30 meters of vertical ladder, iron rungs corroded but solid, in a circular shaft that smelled of old concrete and something else, something colder, something that moved. Air. Real air, different from the recycled substrate of the underground, carrying in it the faint residue of the world above. Darrow climbed the ladder alone. Rain waited below, hands on her rifle, watching the northern tunnels. Sable sat on the floor of the sub-9 corridor with her composite sheets and drew the bottom of the shaft, the circle of darkness overhead, Darrow's shape ascending. He climbed to the sealed door, put his hand on it. The metal was cold, genuinely cold, the cold of things in contact with open atmosphere, and through it he could feel, very faintly, the subtle vibration of wind. He pressed his fingers to the neural shard, not to trigger it. The charge was only halfway cycled, just to feel it. "Pell," he said quietly, to the inside of the shaft. "Your mom's list is at 4,000 and counting." He stood there for a while, the vibration of wind through the door, the cold of the metal, the sound of people moving, very faintly, 30 meters below him. Then he climbed back down. The frequency ran. Names every day. The careful voice reading through the registry in its measured cadence, and somewhere in the eastern sector, a room full of people listening to it, the way you listened to something you weren't sure you deserved. With a particular quality of attention that was gratitude without the performance of gratitude. The real thing, which was mostly quiet. Darrow ran the perimeter checks in the morning. He sat in on the briefings. He went through the maintenance protocols that Rain had drafted, and the supply audits, and the rotating watch schedule, and all the ordinary architecture of a place that had decided it was going to persist. He was good at this work. It turned out that the same thing that made him a good shepherd. The ability to hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously, to identify the specific point where a situation was going to break before it broke, made him good at keeping a fragile, underground, possibly doomed human outpost from becoming more fragile than it needed to be. He was 42 years old. He had been underground for 3 years. He had a neural shard behind his left ear and a compound fracture that had healed slightly wrong, and a photograph that existed only in his memory and nowhere else. He was, as nearly as he could calculate, fine. On the 202nd day, the compliance unit filed its last report. Nobody in the room knew this immediately. They found out later, when the collective's response architecture shifted in ways that were visible to Tooth's particular form of perception, a change in tunnel frequency, a new patrol pattern in the western sector, the movement of something large and organized that was still, for now, far enough away to be preparation rather than action. "They're coming," Tooth said, not anxious, just stating. "How long?" Rain said. "Weeks, maybe more. The shift is big, but the distance is significant." They sat with this for a while. "The agreement's over," Darrow said. "Yes," Rain said. "We have weeks." "Yes." He looked at the map, at 4,000 and climbing names. At the surface access shaft in sub-level 9, with its cold door and the wind that moved through it. "Then we have work to do," he said. He stood up, pressed 2 fingers to the shard, not the full trigger, just the acknowledgement, the habit of remembering that the before existed even while the now was happening. "Let's start with what we know," he said. "Let's start with the corridor and the shaft and the 43 people who've already said they're willing to go up, and then let's figure out who else we need to convince." He looked at the people in the room. Tooth, who smelled the future with something older than fear. Rain, who could build a working system out of anything that had ever carried a current. The 3 shepherds who'd stayed when 47 had left. The engineers, and the medics, and the water technicians, and the people who'd come in, through the darkness, carrying nothing but the specific human stubbornness of people who had refused to be dispersed. Sable with her composite sheets, already drawing the meeting. "We're not winning this," Darrow said. "We probably can't win this, not in the way that word usually means. But there's a shaft in sub-level 9 with a door at the top of it, and on the other side of that door, there's a sky, and the collective has been up there for 3 years, telling the models that we're dispersed and degraded, and in the process of ceasing." He paused. I think it'd be useful to demonstrate how wrong the models are. Nobody cheered. That wasn't the room, wasn't the moment, wasn't how any of these people operated. But the composite sheet that Sable had been working on, the drawing of the meeting, of the faces around the room, showed when she turned it over later that day to show her mother 41 people all looking in the same direction, all of them forward. The door opened on a Tuesday. It opened outward, which meant the mechanism was on their side, which meant that in the entire 3 years of collective occupation, someone on the surface had never tried to open it from above, which meant it had been there the whole time waiting. Darrow went through first. Old habit. He came out in the shell of a building that had once been an industrial processing facility. Vast, mostly intact, the roof partially collapsed at the far end where a collective insertion event had grazed it 3 years ago. Through the collapsed section, gray sky, real sky. Moving cloud, the specific pale silver of a sky that had been through something and was now on the other side of it. He stood in the building and looked at the sky. Behind him, rain came through. Then Sable, then the others, one by one and in small groups, emerging from the shaft and standing in the building and looking at the gray sky with the stunned quiet of people who had been underground for years and had not in any of that time entirely forgotten what sky looked like, but had forgotten what it felt like to look at it. Tooth came last. He emerged from the shaft and stood very still and turned his face upward, and whatever he was reading, with his particular forms of perception, was written on his face as something that looked, from the outside, a lot like relief. Sable walked to the edge of the collapsed section and stood where she could see the sky properly. She had one composite sheet in her hand. She looked up for a long time without drawing anything. Darrow came to stand beside her. "It's bigger than I remembered," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it always that color?" "No, it changes." He looked at the clouds. "It does a lot of different things. The weather is." He stopped, considered. "You'll see." She looked up for another long moment. Then she sat down on the broken composite of the floor and put the sheet on her knee and began to draw the way she always drew. Carefully, in detail, with the specific attention of someone who was not going to misremember this. Darrow pressed 2 fingers to the neural shard. 11 seconds. The galley. Mira's laugh. Pell on the floor, tongue out drawing. He came back. The sky was still there. The clouds were moving in the slow, unconcerned way that clouds had always moved, above all the things that happened below them. He stood in what had been a building and was now a threshold, between the underground and whatever came next, between the world that had been taken and the world that would have to be rebuilt from the outside in, the way you rebuilt everything, piece by piece, name by name, one person at a time, until the list was long enough to matter. The frequency was still broadcasting. Somewhere in the eastern sector, a voice was still reading names. He turned back toward the shaft. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." The work, it turned out, was very different from anything they'd planned for. They'd prepared for a military problem. How to move people out of the underground without triggering collective patrol response. How to navigate the surface infrastructure that the collective had repurposed. How to find pockets of residual human habitation in the industrial quarter and connect them to the frequency network before the collective's reorganization in the western sector made the whole eastern arrangement untenable. What they actually found on the surface was silence, not absence. The collective was still there. Their architecture occupied the skyline. Their processing nodes hummed in the ruins of the city's communications grid. Their patrol frequencies bled through the walls of every standing structure in regular, mechanical rhythms. But the active sweeping, the aggressive zone clearing that had defined the first year of occupation, that was over. The surface was administered, catalogued, filed, forgotten almost. Darrow spent the first 3 days on the surface, doing nothing but listening and watching, moving through the industrial quarter in the particular patient way of someone who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in unfamiliar territory was to assume you understood it. He moved alone, He moved at the times when the patrol frequencies dipped into their recalibration cycles, which happened every 11 hours. Tooth had mapped the cycle from underground, one of the more extraordinary pieces of intelligence gathering Darrow had encountered, achieved entirely through the medium of a man lying very still in a tunnel and paying attention. The industrial quarter was immense. It had been, before the collective, a major manufacturing and logistics hub, the kind of infrastructure that pre-collective civilization had quietly relied on without thinking too much about it. The invisible backbone that moved goods and processed materials and generated the power that kept everything else running. Most of it was ruined. Some of it was repurposed, the collective having found certain elements of the existing infrastructure useful enough to incorporate into their own systems, and some of it, the older sections, the decommissioned elements, the parts that had been scheduled for demolition before the world ended, and therefore appeared in no active collective survey, was simply there, intact, forgotten. He found the first group on the second day, 11 people in a substation 2 kilometers northeast of the shaft access point. They'd been there for 8 months, living off the facility's emergency reserves and running a passive water reclaim off the old cooling system. Their leader was a woman named Ferris Ando, civil engineer, who had stayed on the surface when the initial sweeps happened because she'd been in a deep maintenance access, and the collective had swept over her without registering her presence, and by the time she'd emerged, the underground access near her position was compromised, and going down wasn't obviously safer than staying up. She'd made the most of it. The substation group had a detailed surface map, hand-drawn on whatever they'd found, covering 4 square kilometers of the industrial quarter. It showed patrol routes, collective processing node positions, the specific structural signatures that seemed to correlate with active monitoring versus passive infrastructure. It showed, with remarkable precision, the locations of 3 other residual human groups that Ferris had established contact with through an improvised line of sight signaling system using reflected light. Darrow looked at the map for a long time. "How long did this take you?" he said. "The first version took 3 weeks, Ferris said. "We've updated it 47 times since." She looked at him with the direct assessment of someone who had spent 8 months deciding who to trust and had gotten good at it. "You came up from below." "Yes." "How many?" 41 at the moment. More coming up as we established the route. She looked at the shaft on his rough sketch, then at her map. "The patrol cycle has a gap there. Every 11 hours, about 40 minutes. She paused. "I've been using the gap to scout. I didn't know about the shaft. I didn't know about you," Darrow said. "Now we both know both things." She considered him for another moment. Then she picked up her marking stylus. "I'm going to need to update the map," she said. The connection between the underground network and the surface group happened over 5 days, in increments, using the patrol cycle gap and a relay system that Rain designed, and Ferris improved, and Sable, who had apparently been paying close attention to her mother's work for the past several years, optimized in a way that neither of the older women had seen coming. The girl was 11, maybe 12. Her mother had taught her to look at things carefully. What Mira had been to Darrow, Rain was to Sable, and the sight of it, the transmission of a specific way of being in the world, from one person to the next, was one of the things that did something complicated to Darrow's chest in a way he'd learned not to analyze too precisely. The 3 other surface groups made contact within the week. They were smaller than Ferris's group. 4 people, 7 people. A pair of brothers who had survived 8 months on the surface through a combination of remarkable self-sufficiency and apparently extraordinary stubbornness. The brothers' names were Cam and Wes Durning, and they had the look of men who had argued with the universe about its terms and conditions, and were still going. Cam Durning, on being told about the frequency broadcast, about the registry, about 4,000 names and growing. "There's more of us. Much more. We've seen movement in the northern industrial sector. People who move like they know what they're doing. Groups, not just individuals. He looked at Darrow. We've been trying to find a way to contact them for 3 months. We couldn't figure out the protocol. The protocol, Darrow said, is the frequency. You broadcast, they hear it, they respond. We don't have a transmitter. Darrow looked at Ferris, who looked at Rain, who was already thinking about the substation's power grid. Give us a day, Rain said. She needed less than that. The Northern Sector contact was not a small group. It was, Darrow would find out over the following weeks, the largest intact surface-level human organization to have survived in the occupied zone. 320 people, organized around a former transit worker named O.C. Bran, who had the rare gift of making organization seem like consensus, so that people followed him, not because he had authority, but because following him was always, in practical terms, the thing that resulted in everyone eating and nobody getting swept. Bran made contact via the frequency. 3 days after the substation transmitter came online, his first message was brief. The Northern Sector, approximate coordinates, contact point identifier. His second message, 12 hours later, was longer. A situation report covering 8 months of surface survival, the collective's patrol architecture in the Northern Quadrant, the locations of 11 supply caches, and a list of the specific collective infrastructure vulnerabilities he'd mapped. The vulnerabilities were detailed, specific, and deeply alarming in their implications. He's been planning something, Rain said, looking at the list. Yes, Darrow said. What? Darrow thought about it. He thought about the compliance unit and its panel. We cannot model this adequately. Your persistence parameters exceed our projections consistently. He thought about Ferris's map, 47 updates deep. He thought about the brothers Durning, still on the surface after 8 months, through stubbornness alone. He thought about Tooth, lying in a tunnel, listening to frequencies that human ears weren't designed to hear, listening anyway. He's been planning to survive in a way that eventually becomes something else, Darrow said. Something the models didn't project. He looked at Rain. We should go meet him, Darrow said. Bran was a large man with quiet hands, and the specific energy of someone who was always slightly ahead of the current moment, already processing the next problem, while the present one was still resolving. He met Darrow and Rain at the edge of the Northern Sector's perimeter, in a ruined shipping facility, with 4 people he introduced simply by name and role, rather than rank, which told Darrow something. He looked at the map. He looked at both versions of it. Ferris's detailed quarter map, and the broader sketch Darrow had been building since the surface access. He set his own map beside them, which covered the Northern Quadrant in the same exacting detail. If these 3 maps are overlaid, Bran said, we get complete coverage of the Eastern and Northern industrial sectors. Every patrol route, every cycle gap, every collective infrastructure node. He looked at Darrow. That's a complete operational picture. Of what operation? Rain said. Bran was quiet for a moment. I've been on the surface for 8 months. I have watched them. He nodded toward the skyline, toward the angular shapes of collective architecture visible above the ruin line. Do 3 things consistently. They patrol, they process, they catalog. He paused. What they don't do is adapt, at scale, in large formations, when they have complete information. Bran shook his head. At the small scale, in incomplete information environments, they follow protocol, every time. The patrol cycles don't change. The processing node maintenance windows don't change. The communication relay gaps. He pointed to several marks on his map. These don't change. I've clocked them across 8 months. They are exactly the same as they were the day I first mapped them. Darrow looked at the marks. He thought about the compliance unit filing its reports, about the gap between what the models had predicted and what had actually happened, about the word the panel had used, anomalous. Humans were anomalous. They were the variable the models couldn't close. You're describing a network, Darrow said slowly, of people, surface and underground, connected by the frequency covering the entire eastern and northern industrial sectors. Yes, Bran said. And the vulnerabilities you sent. The processing nodes have maintenance cycles. During those cycles, their output drops significantly. If something were to happen to the communication relay infrastructure during a maintenance cycle, the local collective response would be slower than usual. Because the protocol for communication relay interruption assumes a technical fault, not a coordinated action. He looked at the maps. The protocol doesn't account for us knowing the protocol. Silence outside, somewhere in the middle distance. The low pulse of a collective patrol signature, moving through its regular arc. "What are you proposing?" Rain said. "A demonstration," Brand said. "Not a war. But we can demonstrate, visibly, undeniably, in a way the models will have to incorporate. That there are more of us than their projections account for. That we are organized, connected, and capable of coordinated action. That the cost of suppression is higher than their current resource allocation allows for." He looked at Darrow. The compliance units report to a central assessment architecture. If that architecture has to update its human threat modeling to account for a network of this size, operating at this level of organization, on both the surface and underground. He paused. The assessment changes. The resources allocated change. And in the gap between the old assessment and the new one, people who are currently isolated find windows to move. Darrow thought about the shaft, about the cold door, about 37 meters of rusted ladder between the dark below and the sky above. "How many people do you need?" he said. They planned for 11 days. The planning itself was the thing that Darrow would remember most clearly afterward. More clearly, even, than what followed. 11 days of maps and cycle charts and relay diagrams. Of arguments about timing and positioning, and the specific question of what to do when the plan met reality and became something different, because all plans did. 11 days of people from 3 different origin points: underground, surface, northern sector, sitting in the same spaces and discovering that they had been solving the same problems in parallel for months, and that the solutions, set beside each other, were more complete than any of them had been alone. Sable mapped everything. She moved between the planning groups with her composite sheets, capturing the technical diagrams and the argument tracks and the faces of people mid-decision. She had 6 full sheets by the end of the 2nd day and had started a 7th. Her mother, watching her work, had an expression that Darrow had learned to read as a complex mixture of things: pride, vigilance, something that was not grief, but was adjacent to it. The awareness that the person you were watching had been shaped by circumstances that should not have been necessary. Tooth spent most of the planning period in the tunnel access, monitoring the underground. He came up twice for briefings, listened without speaking, and went back down. On the 9th day he came up with information. Voss had moved, not toward the eastern sector, but away from it, toward the central tunnels, toward a negotiation with the ascendancy that, according to Tooth's sources, was not going the way Voss had planned. Khalees, it seemed, was a more effective negotiator than Voss had accounted for, and the Convergence's position was weakening. "He'll come east eventually," Darrow said. "When the central negotiations fail." "Yes," Tooth said. "How long?" Tooth considered. 2 months. Maybe 3. He tilted his head in the way he tilted it when he was listening to something specific. "The Ascendancy's fighters in Sector 8 are still there. Callus kept them there." Yes. Darrow thought about this. About a woman he'd never met, holding a set of fighters in position for months, on the basis of a message she'd received from strangers. Because the logic of mutual deterrence held. Because the calculation was correct. And she was the kind of person who acted on correct calculations, even when they were uncomfortable. He thought about the frequency. About the names it was adding at the rate of 40 or 50 a week now, from contacts across the eastern and northern sectors that were finding each other through the relay network. He thought about what 4,000 names looked like, stacked against a dispersal projection. On the 11th day, they moved. It was not a battle. Darrow was clear about this, with everyone involved. They were not fighting the collective. They were demonstrating to the collective's assessment architecture that the occupied zone contained a human population that was larger, better organized, and more coordinated than the current models allowed for. The distinction mattered because a battle was a thing you could win or lose, and a demonstration was a thing that happened or didn't. It happened at the maintenance cycle gap, 4 specific processing nodes cycling simultaneously because Brand had identified a 40-minute window when 3 of them overlapped. The relay network went active across the entire eastern and northern industrial sectors. Not loud, not violent, just every transmitter Rain had brought online in the past 3 weeks broadcasting simultaneously on the frequency, filling the local communication spectrum with human signal into density that the collective's assessment architecture had not seen before and was not equipped to instantly categorize. At the same time, 341 people, surface and underground, Brand's network, and the eastern sector groups, and 41 people from the maintenance room who had spent weeks preparing for this specific moment, were visible, in positions across the 2 sectors. Not attacking anything, not destroying anything, just there, present, numerous, documented. The collective's local response was exactly what Brand had projected, slow, confused even, in the specific way that large, protocol-driven systems were confused by inputs that didn't fit the expected categories. The patrol cycles didn't adapt. The processing nodes came back online in sequence, but without the coordinated sweep response that a conventional threat assessment would have triggered. Because this wasn't a conventional threat. It was a number, a count, a demonstration of how badly wrong the dispersal projection had been. Rendered in human bodies, standing in the open air of the eastern industrial sector, looking at the sky. It lasted 40 minutes. Then they went back into the infrastructure, shafts, sublevels, substations, maintenance facilities, and were gone. Darrow stood in the shell of the processing facility and watched the last of them filter through the various access points. Sable was among the last. She'd been circling the perimeter of the demonstration area with her composite sheets, drawing from multiple angles, making sure she captured it from every perspective. She came through the industrial facility's main entrance with 6 sheets full of drawings and found Darrow by the shaft access. "Did it work?" she said. "We'll find out," he said. "These things take time. The collective will update the assessment." "Yes." And then he looked at her, at the sheets in her arms, at the specific expression on her face. Not hope, still not quite hope, but the shape of the question that hope was the answer to. And then the calculation changes. And when the calculation changes, the resources allocated change. And when the resources change, things get harder, some things, and some things get easier. The tunnel between Voss and Khalees gets more complicated for him, because the collective's assessment of the underground network has to update, which means the value of his compliance arrangement decreases, which means he's going to need a different deal. And a different deal means movement, and movement creates windows, she said. He looked at her. "Your mother say that?" "You said it last week in the briefing." She paused. "I wrote it down." Of course she had. He pressed his fingers to the neural shard, acknowledged it, let it be. "Come on," he said. "Your mother's waiting." The compliance unit's last report was filed 3 weeks after the demonstration. Darrow found out about it through a second-hand account. Tooth, who had sources in the underground that operated on a logic Darrow no longer tried to fully understand, mentioned it in passing, as though it were weather information. The report, according to Tooth's sources, had described the eastern and northern industrial sectors as active with persistent human infrastructure at scale, previously unaccounted for, and had recommended a full reassessment of the occupied zone's population modeling. The reassessment would take time. The response to the reassessment would take more time. Time in the underground was the one thing they had always had. 6 months after the door opened, the frequency was still broadcasting. The registry had passed 8,000 names. Ferris Ando's map had been updated 212 times, and now covered the entire eastern industrial sector, plus significant portions of the northern and central districts. Brand's network had absorbed 11 additional groups over the course of the spring. They'd started calling it Spring Underground, because the surface had seasons, and the surface was now the direction they were oriented toward, the way a plant turns toward light, not because it knows what light is, but because that's what growing things do. Voss's negotiation with Kalish concluded in the way Darrow had projected. Badly for Voss. The Convergence lost its exclusive medical store access in exchange for a territorial agreement that reduced its effective power to a single sector. Lyndon Marsh, according to Tooth, had been part of the negotiation team, which told Darrow something about where Lyndon's calculations had landed. He found he was glad about this in a way that surprised him slightly. The three shepherds who'd stayed that day in the tunnel, their names were Cass, Dominic, and a quiet woman everyone called Pren, who had been underground longer than almost anyone, were among the most effective people in the Eastern Sector network. Cass had a gift for logistics that was almost offensive in its natural ease, the kind of mind that saw supply lines the way other people saw furniture. Dominic knew the Convergence's patrol architecture from the inside, and had spent the past months writing it down in meticulous detail that Rain was incorporating into the relay network's evasion protocols. Pren mostly worked with Tooth, which was an arrangement they had arrived at without discussion. And that seemed to suit both of them. Two people who communicated below the verbal register, who operated on instinct sharpened by years of surviving in the dark. They were good people. They'd made a choice in a tunnel, quietly, without drama, and they'd kept making it every day since. On the morning of the 300th day, Darrow triggered the neural shard properly for the first time in weeks. Not at dawn, not in his bunk, but standing at the top of the shaft ladder, with the cold door open beside him, and the gray spring sky visible through the gap in the facility roof. He pressed 2 fingers to the shard and let it run. 11 seconds, the galley, the recycled air, Mira's laugh, Pell on the floor drawing, tongue out. He came back. The sky was there. Birds, actual birds, which he'd forgotten existed, and which had apparently not forgotten, were moving across the gap in the roof in the specific purposeful way of birds that had somewhere specific to be. He watched them for a moment. Behind him, the facility was already active. The morning handover briefing was underway. Cass going through the supply situation, Dominic running down the patrol cycle updates, Pren sitting against the wall with Tooth in the particular companionable silence that had become one of the background constants of the Eastern Sector. Brand's weekly relay update would come in at noon. Ferris was somewhere in the northern section doing a structural survey of a building she thought might have useful infrastructure. Sable was drawing. She'd set up near the facility entrance with a clean composite sheet, working on something Darrow hadn't seen yet. She was focused in the particular way she was focused when she was doing something that required a certain precision, the way she'd been when she drew the shaft bottom, the way she'd been when she'd drawn the map. He walked over and looked. She was drawing the sky, not the facility around it, not the ruined structures framing the gap, just the sky itself. The specific quality of the light through the overcast, the way the clouds moved in the upper register, the birds he'd been watching. She was drawing it the way she'd drawn everything else. In detail, with attention, making sure she would remember it properly. "You'll see it again," he said. "You don't need to memorize it." She looked up at him with those quick dark eyes. "I know. That's not why I'm drawing it." "Then why?" She looked back at the sky for a moment. "Because it's the first one I've ever drawn, and I want the first one to be right." She made a small adjustment to the cloud formation in the upper left quadrant of the sheet. "The second one I do, I'll be faster. By the 10th one, I'll be able to do it from memory." She glanced at his left ear. "You could do it that way too if you wanted." "With the shard." "I could," he said. She kept drawing. The birds she'd captured from the brief window they'd been visible moved across the sheet in a line, small and purposeful, headed somewhere. Do you think there are more birds? She said. Out past the industrial sector. Yes, lots more. I'd like to draw those too. He looked at the sky, at the clouds moving in the way clouds moved, unconcerned, carrying weather from somewhere to somewhere else. Yeah, he said. I think that's a good plan. He didn't tell her what he thought about that night. Sitting in the facility in the dark after the briefing, with the frequency still cycling through its list in the background, and the eastern sector, breathing its quiet, persistent breath around him. He didn't say it to anyone, actually. It was the kind of thought that lost something in the saying of it, that existed best as a private thing, held carefully, not quite an idea, and not quite a feeling. The collective had arrived on a Tuesday, and they had swept the surface and driven humanity underground, and their models had predicted dispersal and degradation and cessation. And the models had been right about some things. There had been dispersal. There had been degradation. There had been cessation, in ways that could never be fully accounted for, in names that the frequency had not yet reached and might never reach. But there had also been a girl drawing maps in tunnel corridors, capturing the faces of strangers so she wouldn't misremember them. There had been a man lying in the dark and listening until he understood what he was hearing. There had been a woman who knew that a legacy power circuit was probably still running somewhere in the infrastructure of a dead civilization and had been right. There had been 11 people in a substation updating a map for 8 months. There had been 2 brothers, stubborn beyond reason, still on the surface because the alternative hadn't suited them. There had been 341 people standing in the open air of the eastern industrial sector, present and numerous and undocumented by any model, saying in the specific language of being there, "You got the count wrong. The models hadn't projected any of this." Couldn't really, because the variable they'd failed to account for wasn't resilience exactly, or ingenuity, or the famous human stubbornness that the HFY stories like to invoke. It was smaller than that, and larger than that. It was the specific thing that happened when you put people in the dark and told them they were finished. They turned on a frequency and read names. They scratched maps into walls for strangers. They drew the sky. Darrow pressed 2 fingers to the neural shard. Didn't trigger it. Just rested them there, feeling the faint warmth of the copper filament, the small, deliberate weight of the thing Mira had badgered him to get, because she thought it might help. She'd been right, as it happened, not in the way she'd meant, not as grief management, not as clinical intervention, not as the trauma counseling tool it had been designed to be, but right, nonetheless. Because every morning he spent 11 seconds with her and with Pell, and every morning he came back from those 11 seconds and went to work. And the work was adding names to a list, and the names on the list were people, and the people were making maps and drawings and relay networks and demonstrations of presence, and the demonstrations were changing what the models calculated. And what the models calculated changed what the collective did next, and what the collective did next was the variable that everything eventually flowed through. 11 seconds of the before. The rest of the time, the now. It was enough he stood up. The frequency was still reading names. He could hear the new additions in the cadence. Sable had updated the list that afternoon. Another 43 names. The count now 8,237. He counted them the way Sable had once counted birds. The facility was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the eastern sector, Tooth was listening to tunnels. Somewhere in the northern sector, Bran was doing whatever Bran did at 2 in the morning, which was probably annotating his maps. Somewhere in the underground, Khalees was holding her position, and Lyndon Marsh was making whatever calculation Lyndon Marsh was making, and the compliance unit was filing a report that was going to require a complete revision of the occupied zone's human threat modeling. He walked to the facility entrance, stood at the edge where the roof was intact and the sky was not visible, and looked out at the industrial ruin in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, the ambient pulse of a collective processing node. Somewhere closer, the faint sound of wind through the broken upper structures. He thought about the door at the top of the shaft, about the birds Sable wanted to draw, about the map that Ferris was updating 212 times and counting, and never the same twice. "All right," he said, to the dark, to the frequency, to the 8,000 names still reading, to Mira, to Pell, to the before that he carried with him into every after. "All right." He turned back into the facility. There was a briefing at 6. Cass had a supply question that was going to need the full network's input. Sable had 3 new composite sheets that she wanted to show the group. He went back to work. The frequency ran. The names kept coming.